Today I'm going to do a topical video, and I'm going to try and help parents who are watching this to establish almost a kind of roadmap for parenting your way through the ROGD experience. The roadmap that I'm thinking about is based on the connection that you have with your child. Your connection is the leverage that you have to help your child move through this kind of gender questioning experience. So I'm going to talk about facilitators and barriers to the connection, and we're going to try to think about the broader context that is happening for your child, including the context of the rest of their life, and then also the context of your parent-child relationship. Now, some of you watching have younger kids or teenagers who just recently started to question their gender, and then some of you have older adult children or older teens that have been questioning for many, many years, maybe since 11 or 12. So that means you're in kind of different places with, what you're dealing with at home. But I'm going to try to offer some information at the beginning of this video, and then towards the end I'm going to kind of break it up to think about, like, if your kid just started questioning, or if you have a really young teen, here are some ways to think about this, and here are some practical steps. And then if you have an older adult child, here are ways to kind of use some of this information and tailor it to your situation. So I'm going to start by actually reading a section of this book that I recommend all the time. It's called Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. This is by Gordon Neufeld and Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate, I believe, is a physician, and Gordon Neufeld is a developmental psychologist. And the thesis of the book is that while teenagers, at least in Western culture, at least right now, tend to get very oriented towards their peers, parents actually matter very much during this time of life. And so I'm going to read something that they've written at the beginning of chapter 1, and actually I found chapter 1 downloadable online. So everyone who sees this is going to get the link to chapter 1 at the bottom of the notes. And also, if you want to purchase the book or listen to it on Audible, you can do that as well. So I'm just going to kind of give some context. At the beginning of the chapter, they discuss the fact that it seems more challenging to parent teenagers these days than maybe people have experienced in the past. So teenagers today, they argue, tend to be kind of less willing to listen to parents, more willing to get in trouble, more willing to break the rules, and get very peer-oriented. Now, I don't think this is necessarily true for all of the gender questioning teenagers that I work with. A lot of them are actually terrified to break the rules, and they're very people-pleasing. But many parents find that when their kid starts to question their gender identity, they kind of become like this different person who suddenly, for the first time ever, becomes really hard to parent and really hard to manage after they've been maybe a very compliant kid most of their life. So anyway, Neufeld and Mate have kind of explained what they believe to be a new phenomenon of teens being much harder to parent, and then they're trying to figure out why. So bear with me, I'm going to read kind of a section of this chapter. What has changed? The problem, in a word, is context. No matter how well-intentioned, skilled, or compassionate we may be, parenting is not something we engage in with just any child. Parenting requires context to be effective. A child must be receptive if we are to succeed in nurturing, comforting, guiding, or directing her. Children don't automatically grant us the authority to parent them just because we're adults, just because we love them, or because we know what's good for them and have their best interests at heart. Step-parents are often confronted by this fact, as are others who have to look after children who are not their own, be they foster parents, babysitters, nannies, or daycare providers, or even teachers. Even with one's own children, natural parenting authority can become lost if the context for it becomes eroded. So if parenting skills or even loving the child is not enough, then what is needed? There's an indispensable, special kind of relationship without which parenting lacks a firm foundation. Developmentalists call it an attachment relationship. For a child to be open to being parented by an adult, he must actively be attaching to that adult. be wanting contact and closeness with the adult. At the beginning of life, this drive to attach is quite physical in nature. The infant literally clings to the parent and needs to be held. If everything unfolds according to design, the attachment will evolve into an emotional closeness and finally a sense of psychological intimacy. Children who lack this kind of connection with those responsible for them are very difficult to parent or often to teach. Only the attachment relationship can provide the proper context for child rearing. The secret of parenting is not in what the parent does, but rather who the parent is to the child. When a child seeks contact and closeness with us, we become empowered as a nurturer, a comforter, a guide, a model, a teacher, or coach. For a child to attach well to us, we are her home base from which to venture into the world, her retreat to fall back on, her fountainhead of inspiration. All the love in the world cannot get through without the psychological umbilical cord created by the child's attachment. The attachment relationship of the child to the parent needs to last at least as long as the child needs to be parented. This is what is becoming more difficult in today's world. Parents haven't changed. They've not become less competent or less devoted. The fundamental nature of children has also not changed. They've not become less dependent or more resistant. What has changed is the culture in which we are rearing our children. Children's attachment to parents no longer is getting the support required from our culture and society. Even parent-child relationships that at the beginning are powerful and fully nurturing can become undermined as our children move out into a world that no longer appreciates or reinforces the attachment bond. Children are increasingly forming attachments that compete with their parents, with the result that the proper context for parenting is less available to us. Not a lack of love or of parenting know-how, but the erosion of the attachment context is what makes our parenting ineffective. So they're basically saying that our culture is not supporting the importance of the parent-child attachment. I'd like to know when they wrote this book. Let me see. This was written in 2006. I really wonder what Gabor and Mate think of the current culture in which parenting is being directly undermined by the affirmative model of care for gender dysphoria. So now that we've thought about the fact that kids need to be attached to somebody who, I often think they need to be attached to the wisest, most reasonable person who loves them the most. And often, as much as teenage relationships are important, other teenagers are fickle. They themselves are going through their own adolescent struggles, so they don't make really great attachment figures, right? They don't make a good person to attach to. I'm guessing many of you have children who have a friend who's got mental health issues and maybe has struggled a lot with like depressive episodes or anxiety, and then your teenager is kind of acting as their surrogate counselor. Or maybe your teenager is the one with those mental health issues and there's some friend that they've kind of leaned on so heavily that it's probably a burden on the other teen. So we know teenagers need an attachment figure that's stable, that's calm, that can help act as like a life raft when they're going through these very turbulent waters of adolescence. But what's happening is that teenagers are getting attached to other things. So they could get attached to a new self-concept. So for many kids who have binge-watched dozens and dozens of YouTube videos about transition, especially if the people they're watching are kind of celebrity figures, your child might be attached to this image of themselves in their mind of who they'll be if they transition. Sometimes kids are drawing themselves as boys constantly, you know? So they could be attaching to an idea. They could be attaching to the idea of being trans. It might be playing some kind of a role for them, and they could get attached to that. It's not only just being attached to individual people, especially these days when kids are online so much, they can kind of create the idea of who some of these internet friends are and become attached to that. So really they're attached to like an avatar. like somebody's screaming, but they're not actually in a real relationship with someone who can be there for them and like comfort them in real time. So these are kind of these virtual attachments. They can also become attached to labels and self-diagnoses. Like one of the kind of issues that I see more broadly is that many young people are very fixated on a kind of glorification of having a mental health condition. So they can become attached to that. Now, they can also become attached to other peers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this as we go, but you know, some of these peers, as I said, can be virtual, and they can also be peers in real life. Sometimes, you know, parents will tell me that their child has a peer group and like half of the kids or all of the kids are identifying as trans, and your child might be really attached to those peers. And as I said before, it could be screen characters or people in anime. I wouldn't say people, cartoons in anime, or their favorite kind of trans celebrities, or even like kids, some kids get really attached to the furries thing. So, you know, these are interests and also can become attachments. Now, I don't want to make it sound as though your child should exclusively be attached to you to the exclusion of everything else. That's not at all what I'm saying. So let's think through what is a positive thing that a child can get attached to, especially as they kind of move through these developmental stages and get older. So they might be really attached to a hobby. It could be very positive. So if they are an illustrator or if they really like to draw, they can get very, very absorbed by that and become really attached to that part of themselves, or that you know, if they have like another favorite illustrator, they might get really attached to that person. And these are fine if it supports their well-being. So, you know, they might get really attached to themselves in theater. You know, some kids are really creative and great actors, and so they get really attached to their theater identity. Or they might get attached to a skill that they're developing, like a sport or something like that. Those are healthy attachments, and those are healthy things to nurture in your child. And you can kind of do almost like a gut check as a parent. How do I feel when I know my daughter's off at soccer? Am I feeling like really good about that? You know, there may be some peripheral things going on. Maybe she is kind of like not getting along with one of the girls there or something like that. But in general, how do you feel about your child exploring these hobbies or these new attachments? And it might even be other peers. So I often will meet families who their child really struggled socially for a long time and had a hard time making friends. And then when the child met other kids in like an LGBT group, they all had similar personalities insofar as like maybe they were kind of quirky, they were a little bit socially awkward, very intelligent, but finally, you know, some parents say finally she found her people. And so parents can feel really conflicted about this, because on one hand, these attachments are offering something healthy. Maybe these are kids who accept your child for all their quirks, and she finally found people who are, you know, nice to her and accept her. And on the other hand, these attachments might also be fostering her trans identity, or maybe something that you feel is not a good fit for her. So it can be complicated. It's obviously not black and white, you know? And especially as a child gets older, you know, they also have to start detaching from parents and attaching to new things. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think when your child is attaching to new things that are positive, it brings out your child's positive qualities. So I'm going to kind of give you some ways to think about this. If your child is spending a lot of time on the attachment, what does that do to your relationship? So here's an example. Let's say your child has a new friend at school. You don't really know much about this kid yet, but your child obviously really, really likes this person. After your child has spent a lot of time with this kid, does your child want to come downstairs and kind of like tell you how that time was, or tell you everything about that person, or talk about them incessantly? Or, you know, is your child kind of being around you the way that they would any other time? If so, that might be, you know, an appropriate attachment, even if you're concerned about how that child thinks or what that child is into. But if you if your child is spending a lot of time on a particular attachment, whether that's virtual friends or a peer from school, and then after they spend time with that person, they start treating you very poorly, or like everything becomes very secretive and all of their thoughts go underground, to me that might indicate that it's a competing attachment, right? So some attachments are complementary and some might be competing. And I really love the book Hold On to Your Kids, because one of the things they talk about is, you know, as a parent, what you can do to support your child having friendships and having other attachments is to be kind of the facilitator of those. So they recommend, you know, be the family that always has the kids over. Invite them to sit with you in the living room. Ask the kids, hey guys, you want to make pizza from scratch, you know? You guys all help me. So you can be kind of part of the conversation, part of the relationship, so that the children that you're inviting over know that your relationship with your child is important too, rather than they're only by themselves all the time kind of doing secret things. I think that's a really great suggestion, and I would recommend for anybody who's struggling with like their kids' new friends or something like that to read the book and see what Gabor and Mate have to say about it, because they give a lot of great ideas on how to actually be part of the relationship that your child has with their peers. And you know, another great thing about doing that, about inviting these peers into your home, is that you can kind of notice and make observations when you're alone with your child. So if they have a friend, for example, who's very, very pushy and constantly telling all the other kids what to do, you know, you might be able to actually make that observation if you've spent some time around this kid and around your child and her friends, you know. So you might, you know, after the kids leave, you might say, gosh, it was really fun to have them over. Did you have a good time? And then you might say, you know, I really like so-and-so. However, I have noticed that when you guys spend time together, she seems to tell everybody what to do. Have you noticed that? Or, you know, you can make observations, but if your children's friendships have become out of your control and you have no say over how things are going, then you really have no idea what's going on kind of behind closed doors in your children's friendships.